Well, when I was a kid, I used to like to watch the cartoon Popeye. Anybody else? Now, I was thinking about this the other day, and I thought, you know what? Nowadays, they wouldn't make that cartoon because it's not very politically correct. With all the fighting and with the helpless olive oil, and all this. I don't think it would fly today, but I just remember watching it and thinking it was really funny. And one of the things I remember as a kid thinking was funny is Brutus, the bad guy. A lot of times they would show him and he would have, because he was the real manly one, and they would show him with this tattoo on his chest of like a battleship. And then sometimes when he and Popeye would get into a fight and stuff like that, the battleship would split in half and sink. The tattoo would do it. But I just remember the show and thinking it was really funny. But when I watched Popeye, inevitably what would happen is that Popeye would get himself into trouble. Either he was losing the fight, or olive oil was being taken by Brutus and he couldn't get her back, or he was chained up or tied up. Something would happen and he was in trouble because he just was not strong enough. And so what would he do? Well, he'd pull out his can of spinach or pry it out with his pipe, or however he would do it. Somehow he would get that spinach out and get it open, and he would eat the spinach. And when he'd eat the spinach, all of a sudden he had this surge of power. He was really strong. And sometimes his fists would become giant hammers. And it was just that spinach. And now he was unstoppable, and he would go and save the day. Now, I learned as a kid very quickly that was unrealistic. Because I tried it. I ate the spinach, and what happened? Nothing. Eating spinach doesn't really have a magical way of making you strong. It's not really a source of great strength that happens all of a sudden. Well, that's all fun, but let's get serious now. In real life, we face real difficulties, and we need real strength. But where do we find strength? And you may know the answer to that question. Where do we find strength? You may know the right answer, the best answer to that question. But you still may be looking elsewhere. You may be looking for your magic spinach. Something else that's going to somehow just give you what you think you need. And so this morning we want to ask that question. Where can we find strength? And are you looking in the right place? So we start this morning, we're going to be starting in chapter 29. But before we read there, let me just back up just for a second and remember where David is. David had gotten scared, and he, being afraid of Saul, he ran away from Saul and ran to the Philistines, to Achish, the king of Gath. Eventually, he was given his own city, Ziklag, and then he went out and he was raiding cities and stuff like that. And the whole time he lied. Well, first his integrity was compromised when he wasn't being totally upfront, but then he flat out lied, and then he was killing people. And you remember he was there, and he got to the point where Achish totally trusts David. And that's where we were in chapter 28. Let me read that for you. Chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. It says, "In those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, 'Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army.' David said to Achish, 'Very well, you shall know what your servant can do.' And Achish said to David, 'Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life.'" So David has lied his way into the confidence of Achish. Achish completely trusts him. And now David has gotten himself into this impossible situation where he is expected to go out and fight with the Philistine army against his own people, Israel. What's David to do? Now, we left it that way a couple weeks ago, and now we're coming back to it. But the rest of chapter 28 goes and deals with Saul. And the author took that kind of out of chronological order in order to let it sit there on David. So you could sit there and think about that. What's he going to do? But we're going to go ahead and jump up. And today we're going to look at chapters 29 and 30. And next week we'll come back to 28 and 31 and finish off the book. So today we start chapter 29, verses 1 through 5. It says, "Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, 'What are these Hebrews doing here?' And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, 'Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day.' But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, 'Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And so the Philistine leaders are all gathering together with their armies. And as they're parading by, Achish marches past, and the leaders notice David and his men. And they recognize him. They know who he is. And these leaders are actually besides themselves. They can't believe that Achish would even think to do this. Why would you bring David here? How could you be so foolish? I mean, you do understand we're getting ready to go fight against his people, right? And they just can't believe that he would do this. But see, Achish trusts David. And he gives a very simple answer to them. Well, David deserted from Saul. He's changed sides. He's totally loyal to me. I have no problems with him. He's been with me for a long time. And he's loyal. He totally trusts David, and he sees no reason not to. He has been completely deceived by David. Well, the other leaders, though, they don't share his optimism. They don't think that David will be loyal as Achish does. And they know that song. Saul's killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. Now, who were those thousands of people they were talking about? Philistines. That's us. They sing about killing us. And David is the key figure. They don't share Achish's optimism that he's on their side. They don't trust him, and they're afraid of him, and they demand that David be sent home. See, their thinking actually makes perfect sense, because their thinking is, we'll go into battle, and then what's going to happen? David is all of a sudden going to turn on us and ambush our armies, who he's in the middle of, and start fighting for Israel, and he will kill a bunch of these men. It says that doesn't make sense. And not only that, it would make sense that he would do that, because what better way for David to get back into good graces with Saul but to turn against us and start killing us in the middle of battle and helping Israel? So they say, no way. He needs to go back home. Now Achish now has to tell David, and of course he's very disappointed. Look at verse 6. It says, then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives. Now that's interesting, because that word Lord there is Yahweh. So God, David's God. So as the one true God lives, as Yahweh lives, you have been honest. And to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you, the other Philistine leaders. Verse 7, so go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. And David said to Achish, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? And Achish answered David and said, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now the irony is so thick in these verses. I mean, Achish is absolutely certain that David has been honest with him. And he praises David for his honesty here. In fact, he even appeals to Yahweh, David's God, in insisting that David has been honest. But David has not been honest at all. Achish goes on to defend David, and he's actually apologetic in his defense. And he's like, I know, the other leaders, I would love to have you come, but the other guys, they say no. Achish has no idea that David isn't really loyal to him or to the Philistines. On the other hand, David, when he hears this, he continues his charades and he acts like he's insulted by this. How could you say that? Why wouldn't you let me come? And he uses his words, what have I done? Now, David has asked that question a couple other times that we've read. In those times, he was talking to Saul. And in those times, it was actually true. He had done nothing wrong. But now he's just playing the part and supporting his lies. But when we see this and we see David react so strongly, it might make us a little uncomfortable. Why would he do that? Why would David act this way? Well, some people have suggested that David wants to do exactly what the Philistine leaders think that he wants to do. That he will go into battle with them and then turn on them and fight against them and help the Israelites. The only problem with that is if David is even seen marching into battle with the Philistines, it can look like treason. And people would say, how could you go to battle with the Philistines? Even if he eventually turned, he would say, how were you good enough graces with the Philistines that you could go to battle with them, that they would allow you, that they would trust you? Another reason why David might act like this is he may be trying to find out if the other leaders have heard something. You remember, he's living in Philistine territory. And he may be trying to find out, since they're so opposed to him coming, have they heard about what I've been doing? Have they caught word? Is it safe for me to go back to Ziklag, to go back home in his temporary home? Or do I need to get out of Philistine territory? But whatever the reason, it comes down to, he has to keep up his appearances. He's been lying, and he's been living out this lie. And it would be dangerous for him to all of a sudden act like, oh great, I don't have to fight against my people. He's surrounded by the Philistine armies. What if he acted like that? No big deal. Oh, this is awesome. You're letting me go? I'm out of my problem. He's got to keep up his appearances because they would all be in danger. So he has to act like he's not happy that he can't go into battle. But when he does this, you almost worry that David's going to protest so strongly that Achish is going to say, okay, let me go back and talk to him again. And demand, you got to let David come. But Achish doesn't. He bows to their wishes and he just says, no, you've got to go. So David has gotten out of his predicament and he goes home in the morning. And so here's the things we're seeing here so far. The other leaders are wiser than Achish because they haven't been blinded by David's deception. David has to be relieved, and yet he can't show it. And so he acts like he's angry, like he's upset, rather than relieved and happy. And then David has gotten out of his impossible situation but not as a result of anything that he himself has done. In fact, there really was nothing he could do. He was stuck because he had gotten himself into this mess. And so although God is not specifically mentioned here, a lot like the book of Esther, God is not specifically mentioned here other than in the words of Achish. It is clear, the implication is clear, that this is not just some happy accident. David didn't just get lucky, but that God rescued him. That God caused these Philistine leaders to say, there is no way he's coming into battle with us. And so again, we see God doing something surprising through surprising people. Unexpected that he would use these Philistines to save David's life, but he has done it once again. You see, this is God's doing. This is God's providence. And we see it throughout the book of 1 Samuel. But we see it here as well. David was wrong, and he was in that wrong place. He had gotten himself into this mess. And what's interesting about that is David wasn't looking for God's help here. I mean, he wasn't looking for God. What has David been doing for the last couple of years? Whatever he wanted to do, whatever he felt like doing, whatever he thought he should do. We haven't read, in the last several chapters, we haven't read anything about David consulting God or talking to God or praying to God, anything between David and God. And so he's just been going on here for this year and a half, 2 years, just running away and hiding. David is not where he should be. But God, in his mercy, still rescues him. So what's that? What can we apply to that? Is this a guarantee that every time we get ourselves into a mess that God is going to rescue us from it? No. God may sometimes rescue you. But God may not always pull you out of this position. When you make a mess of things and you get yourself in this position, or when you drift away from God, or when you flat out just walk away, God is not necessarily going to come and just rescue you. Sometimes he allows you to suffer the consequences of your sin. In fact, often you get to suffer the consequences of your sin. Suffer the consequences of your faithlessness. And hopefully when that happens, we learn from it. Because God will use those things to discipline us, to turn us back to him, to open our eyes to see where we have done wrong. But this thing is certain. Whether we are in a mess or not, one thing is certain. God is always there, even if we're not looking. He's always there, even if we're not looking. God may be working in the background of your situation, but we know that he is able to protect. We know that he is able to rescue. And sometimes we get to look back in our lives, and even if we didn't notice it at the time, we can look back in our lives and say, look what God did. He was there and he was moving. I wasn't looking, but God rescued me. May not notice it at the time, but we can look back and praise God that he was there even when we weren't looking. So back to our story. David heads home, but when he gets there, his relief turns to devastation. Look at chapter 30, verses 1 through 5. It says, now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negev and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives had also been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And so this group of Amalekites have been making rounds through Philistine territory, and that's a great time to do it. You know why? All the fighting men are gathered up for battle. And so there's no one there to really protect the cities and protect the people. So they've been making their rounds through Philistine territory and also the southern Israelite territory, and they've been raiding towns, including Ziklag, which is where David and his men lived. And we're told here that they didn't kill anyone, but they took them. Now, this is both good and bad news. It's good because they're not dead. It's bad because what are they going to do with these people? They're going to make them slaves, and probably many of them will be sold as slaves. And so these people are not dead, but they're not in a good situation. They came and they took all the people, women, children, probably older people, the people who couldn't fight, who wouldn't have gone to battle, and all their stuff, and they burned the cities. This is what David and his men come home to. And now you can imagine the shift in emotions. Yes, we got out of that one. For 3 days they're walking home or coming home, and they're probably talking about it. This is great. We get to go home. We don't have to fight against Israel. We got out of it. And then they get close to home and they look up and they see their city as the ashes are smoldering. And their joy and their relief is dashed. Look what happened while we were away. And they rush to the city and they get there and they find it. Everyone and everything of value is gone, and their city is burnt. And we're told that they all broke down and wept. These warriors, these mighty men, broke down and wept. And really there was nothing else to do. They were gone. I mean, at this point, they don't have any idea who did this. We were told, but David doesn't know. Who did this? Where'd they come from? Where'd they go? We just got home and everything's gone. Can it get worse? Yeah, look at verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So on top of the anguish of losing his family, now David has another problem. His men want to kill him. You see, they're blaming him. They're turning on him and blaming him for what has happened. And in part, it is his fault. It's because of his running away from God and his lying to Achish that they were gone at the battlefront and not there to protect their people. And so they are after him. Really what it is these are just men of action, and they want some action. They want someone to pay. And so they're ready to take it out on David. But then comes the key statement of this entire passage. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David went from bad to, oh, that's good, to terrible, to even worse, they want to kill me, to I need God. And he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He turned to the greatest source of comfort and strength. He did what he hadn't done in a long time. He turns back to God where he should have been all along. But it took problem after problem after problem for him to get there, for him to come, for him to realize what was missing and what he needed. But now he remembers where his strength comes from. He remembers God. And you know what? There's a challenge for us there that we learn from David's mistake. That we don't have to go through those things. We don't have to wait for problem after problem after problem to go, strength comes from God. That's where I need to be. But we can learn from David's mistake and don't wait for things to get terrible before we turn to God. Go to him now. Spend time with him now. Stay close to him now. Well, let's keep reading verse 7. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. Now, we haven't heard this for a long time. But the ephod, if you remember, is the thing that the priest wore that had the Urim and Thummim, the stones in them, to where God gave them this ability to ask him direct questions and that God would answer him through the priest, through the stones. And so at this point, David is turning to God and consulting God. What should I do? And so he tells Abiathar to come with the ephod. In verse 8, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? In other words, shall I go chase them? Shall I overtake them? Will I be successful? God answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. Now that, you get that? What's God saying? You'll be successful. You will find them and you will rescue your people and your things. So he says, go. So verse 9, so David set out and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook of Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. So some of the men had to stop. They got too tired and they stayed there and watched the baggage. Verse 10, but David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind who were too exhausted to cross the brook of Besor. They found an Egyptian in the open country. And okay, so David and his men, they're just out there. Where are they headed? I don't know. They're just looking for these raiders wherever they might be. So they're out in the open in the middle of nowhere. And they come across this man. Verse 11, they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirits revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So this guy has just been out there in the middle of nowhere all by himself, starving to death and thirsting to death. And so they take care of him, they feed him, and they give him strength, and now he can talk. And David said to him, to whom do you belong and where are you from? He said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. What a terrible guy. He doesn't want to be bothered with this sick servant, this sick slave. And so he says, you're slowing me down. And he left him to die. Verse 14, we had made a raid against the Negev of the Cherethites and against that which belongs to Judah and against the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Now they know who it is. Who burned Ziklag? He said, it was our group. And David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band. So he says, basically, as long as you don't hurt me or let someone else, my master, hurt me, then I'll tell you. Verse 16, and when he had taken them down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So the people are there, they find them, and where they're spread all over, they're having a huge party. They're just eating and drinking, they're having a great time, they're dancing, they're celebrating. Look at what we've got, we're rich. And David finds them all spread out there in verse 17, and David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, this is David's spoil. Now, there's 2 things I want to point out that we need to catch from this passage. One, when they found that man in the absolute middle of nowhere, that was huge. Let me remind you again, they didn't know who had attacked Ziklag and taken their family members. They didn't know where they were from, and they didn't know where they were going. And so they just went out to the middle of nowhere looking for someone. And then they ran into this guy who was almost dead. They fed him, took care of him, fed him, got his strength up. And he told them everything they needed to know. Just looking through the land till all of a sudden now we have all the information because of this man. Now God had told David, go, you'll be successful. But now as they find this man, we see that God is making it happen. God put that man there in their path, caused them to find him, and gave them the information they needed in order to be successful. God was making it happen. The second thing I want you to notice, I want to read this again, verses 18 and 19. Look what it says. It says, David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. You see those words? All. Nothing was missing. Not anything. All. So how much of their stuff did they get back? All of it. They were completely, perfectly successful. What did God promise? You will recover it. You will rescue it. You will be successful. What God promised, God did. And so we see that God perfectly kept his promise. Now, why do we doubt God? Why do we fail to trust God? It's not because of some weakness in God. It's not because God isn't good to his word. We just fail to do it for some reason. Sometimes we look elsewhere. But I want us to catch this, to get this. God is not the last resort. Although sometimes people treat him that way. We'll try this and try this and try this. Oh, we should go to God. God is not the last resort. You know, as if when all else fails, go to God. But I do want you to recognize that when all else fails, God doesn't. So don't treat him like a last resort, but recognize that even if everything else fails, God doesn't. He's there and we can go to him at any time. God doesn't fail. He is where we find strength. So why wouldn't we draw near to him all the time? Well, we got to wrap up this story. So what will they do with all that stuff that they're bringing back home? Look at verses 21 to 30, or 31. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook of Besor. And they went out to meet David, to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man lead away his wife and children and depart. But David said, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. they shall share alike. And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoils of the enemies of the Lord." It was for those in Bethel and Ramoth and Negev and a whole bunch of other places where David and his men had roamed. And so David, what does he do with the spoil? Well, some of it he takes and sends to some of his friends. Right away he just sends it out to some of the towns around. Now it's possible and pretty likely that because of where these towns were located, that they may have fell victim to raiders. Maybe even these raiders. But I don't think that's the real reason, the main reason why David is sending them stuff. It's actually a good political move. David knows he's going to be king someday, and he's building those friendships. And he has these friends and he wants to give them stuff, and they will then support him as king later on. But before that, when they were on their way back, when they were returning, we saw that some of those men got greedy. Some of the men in his army got greedy. And they said, you know what? Let's keep all the stuff for ourselves. And since those men didn't come with us, they don't get anything, just their family back. And David put a stop to that talk right away. He says, that's not the way it is. Everyone gets their share, no matter what their job is, because there's lots of different jobs and everyone has to do something. Everyone gets their share. And it becomes a standing rule in Israel. But notice something. Earlier in chapter 7, in verses 17 to 20, it said this: David struck that band of rebels or raiders. It says David recovered. It says David rescued. David captured. And when they're coming back with all the livestock, the people say, this is David's spoil. But now what did David say? Look at verse 23. And David said, you shall not do so, my brothers. Why? With what the Lord has given us. Everyone else, they said, this is David. Did David work for that? Well, yeah, he did. He went and fought and he led this army. He did work for it. But where did it come from? God. He says this was a gift from God. You see, David has that right perspective. Even though he worked for it, it was God's. And God gave it to them. This is a blessing from God. His perspective about things, about stuff, is correct. He says, we wouldn't have this if it wasn't for God. Everything he had was given them by God. It sounds a lot like what James says when he says, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. Everything we have is from God. Do I work for it? Well, yeah, maybe. Well, not all of it. Some things just get given to you. But even if I worked for it, it's from God. He's the one that blesses you. He's the one that makes you able to do it. He's the one that gives it to you. And I just wanted to quickly make the point. Don't be selfish with God's blessings. Don't be selfish with what God has given you. Don't be greedy. Don't be selfish. But remember, everything we have is from God. It's His. And so let's go back to our original question we asked this morning. Where can we find strength? And are you looking in the right place? Well, David gives us an answer. In many of the Psalms, David writes this. But let me give you a couple. Psalm 118, verse 14, David says, the Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. In Psalm 28, 7, he says, the Lord is my strength and my shield. In Him my heart trusts, and I am helped. My heart exults, and with my song I give thanks to Him. And we could go on and on. There are a ton of Psalms where David writes the same thing, and other psalmists write the same thing. Where does our strength come from? From God. He is our strength. But then we can turn to Isaiah, and Isaiah says the same thing. He gives us the same answer. Isaiah 12:2. Isaiah writes, behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and I will not be afraid. For the Lord God is my strength and my song, and He has become my salvation. And then Isaiah also says in Isaiah 40, verses 28 to 31, he says, have you not known? Now, this is a pretty well-known verse, but listen to it. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint. And to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Where does strength come from? Well, it comes from the Lord. Are you looking in the right place? Look to God. Find your strength in your God.